For the fourth and fifth episodes on this series on anxiety, having gone into a fair bit of detail as it relates to the central nervous system in the episode prior, I'm now going to go into the more measurable effects of the peripheral nervous system, and especially the part of this system which is involuntary, the autonomic nervous system, as well as the hormonal responses that are involved. After this, I'll be able to better explain how to leverage this using certain techniques that reverse this state. Techniques that are not only useful for those with frequent periods of anxiety, but actually particularly useful for those who experience states of severe panic as a consequence. I can then also round off this series with my recommendations for the most effective supplements in this space, having read extensively through the research to date on this topic. How does the stress response start? Well, when a stressor is perceived, the sympathetic nervous system quickly mobilizes the body's resources. Simultaneously, the activation of the HPA axis, which is a hormonal axis, ultimately culminates in the production of cortisol by our adrenals. Essentially, what this results in is the rise in both cortisol and circulating catecholamines, being adrenaline and noradrenaline. With both systems working together to alter physiological states, catecholamines quickly mobilize energy, while cortisol makes sustained energy available by influencing glucose metabolism. Now, this sympathetic nervous system activation leads to, amongst other things, the dilation of our pupils, dilation of our airways, increase in breathing rate, heart rate, and blood pressure, all to ensure the enhancement of oxygen uptake and the rapid delivery of oxygen and nutrients to essential organs. All the while, cortisol works to increase the availability of glucose via various metabolic mechanisms which ensure a persistent rise in blood sugar levels. These adjustments, alongside the effects previously described within the brain regions that predispose us to a state of hypervigilance, when adaptive, are obviously critical in preparing the body and mind for immediate and sustained engagement. The opposite arm of the autonomic nervous system being the parasympathetic nervous system, well, this kicks in during the recovery period post-stress. Now, post-stress, the parasympathetic nervous system facilitates recovery by reducing sympathetic activity. It does this primarily in local and targeted ways, largely as a consequence of the targeted and local action of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine is released by the parasympathetic nerve fibers at various organ sites. It binds to muscarinic receptors on the target organs, which directly counters the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, acetylcholine can also inhibit the release of noradrenaline from sympathetic nerve endings, thereby reducing the sympathetic nervous system's activity directly. This results in the predictable reversal of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, intended to restrain the stress response and prevent overexertion. These responses are incredibly complicated, for which in the healthy individual occur appropriately, in that threats which prompt activation of the sympathetic nervous system, well, they're reasonable, and it's generally rational to suggest that the threat warrants this reaction, as well as the fact that the reaction is dampened down promptly after the threat is no longer present. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the issue with abnormal anxiety is that it's a vague, non-specific, diffuse reaction to often not one thing in particular, and it's often mistaken as fear. However, being anxiety, there isn't a specific trigger that can be identified and acted upon to dampen down this state of heightened arousal. So with both anxiety and fear, psychologically speaking, they differ considerably, but physiologically speaking, they're largely indiscriminate, in so much as the body responds in the same way. In cases of abnormal anxiety, this is where the problem lies. Because there's nothing in particular in front of the individual that needs avoiding, that will ultimately remedy this state of arousal. What occurs as a consequence is a prolonged stress response which continues to persist. Over time, this state of prolonged stress leads to a disruption in the key components of our hormonal feedback response and parasympathetic nervous system, which ultimately aim to put the brakes on. Consider driving a car and simultaneously pressing the accelerator and the brakes at the same time. Do this for long enough, and those brake pads get worn down. This is exactly what happens in the body. Now, there's evidence to suggest that for some that are predisposed to either anxiety disorders or generally high in trait anxiety, that this hormonal axis, the HPA axis, and specifically the feedback system aimed at reducing its activity, and or the parasympathetic nervous system which acts as the brake, well, these were less effective to begin with. This has everything to do with genetic disposition, baseline vagal tone, early life events, stresses, or even trauma. which may ultimately expose the individual at key parts in development to the damaging effects of persistently raised inflammatory markers and a persistent stress response. But either way, whether it's the inappropriate triggering of the stress response, the inefficiency of the systems intended to dampen it down, or all of these things, the crux of the issue as it relates to the physiological effects is the imbalance of these opposing components, and therefore its remedy lies in the correction of it. With that in mind, I'm now going to explain various techniques which aim to reduce this imbalance. First, diaphragmatic breathing. This is a deep breathing technique that engages the diaphragm, a large muscle located at the base of the lungs. This technique is highly effective in managing stress and anxiety, largely as a result of its activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. This technique can be utilized during both moments of acute anxiety to quickly restore calmness, or practiced regularly to help reduce overall anxiety levels and enhance emotional regulation over time. So the method of diaphragmatic breathing includes the following steps. So first, positioning. Sit comfortably with your back straight or lie flat on your back with your knees slightly bent and head supported. Place one hand on your upper chest and the other just below the rib cage, allowing you to feel the movement of your diaphragm. Second, inhalation. Slowly inhale through your nose, feeling your stomach pushing up against your hand. Keep the hand on your chest as still as possible. This just helps to ensure that the diaphragm is pulling air into the bases of the lungs. Thirdly, pause. So hold the breath for a brief moment at the end of inhalation. Fourth, exhalation. Exhale through pursed lips if lying down or through the nose if seated to control the release of air. Engage your stomach muscles to gently push the air out, feeling the hand on your abdomen move as you exhale. Fifth, breathing ratio. So aim for the exhalation to be twice as long as the inhalation, such as inhaling for 4 seconds and exhaling for 8 seconds. This ratio helps to maximize the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, enhancing the relaxation effect. And lastly, the practice duration. Continue this breathing cycle for several minutes until you feel calm and relaxed. You can generally increase the duration as you get more comfortable with this practice. With all of these steps in this method, whether you choose to exhale through pursed lips or through the nose, struggle with the ratio of the inhale to exhale, find pausing after inhaling uncomfortable, don't get too caught up on these details. The essential part to take into account is ensuring that the breaths are deep, slow, and they are engaging the diaphragm. The second technique is the 4-7-8 technique. This is the same as the diaphragmatic breathing with slight adjustments. That is the specific duration of the components to the breathing cycle, airway passage entry, and the maintenance of focus on these aspects. With this technique again, it's diaphragmatic and you'll be in either a sitting or lying position. But here, there are just slight modifications. These are preparation by exhaling. So start by fully exhaling through your mouth with a kind of whoosh sound to empty the lungs completely. This step prepares you for a deep inhalation and ensures that each breath cycle starts from a baseline. The second modification is that there is a slightly more controlled inhalation. So inhalation here is through your nose for a count of 4. This should be a deep diaphragmatic inhalation, allowing your belly to expand as you fill your lungs with air. After inhaling, hold your breath for a count of 7. This pause allows the oxygen to saturate your bloodstream and promotes a sense of calm that ultimately prepares your body for a prolonged, relaxing exhalation. Extended exhalation. So this is the last modification, being that the exhalation will be completely through your mouth, making the same whoosh sound for a count of 8. This extended exhalation is twice as long as the inhalation and it is key to stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system and removing the CO2 from the bloodstream, which is a potent source of anxiety when levels are high. Again, with this technique, although more specific in its instructions, the key is mental focus on the breath and utilizing the abdomen to ensure a slower breathing rate. If the particular ratios are hard to begin with, start with periods which feel comfortable and look to work up to the recommended intervals. Each session should last about 1 to 2 minutes, depending on your comfort and pace. The next technique is progressive muscle relaxation. Step 1 would be to sit or lie down in a comfortable position. Close your eyes and take a few deep breaths to begin relaxing. Now you want to begin to tense and relax muscle groups. Start with your feet and work your way up to the face, or vice versa. Tense each muscle group for about 5 seconds and then relax it for about 10 to 20 seconds. And concentrate on the change between the tension felt and the relaxation after it. And common muscle groups involved in this technique include the feet, calves, thighs, glutes, stomach, chest, arms, hands, neck, and face. These muscle groups are to be tensed in pairs, i.e. both calves, both legs, etc. Each session will roughly take 10 to 20 minutes. It can be practiced as an acute remedy to states of anxiety, or indeed the daily practice is also recommended for longer-term effects on reducing baseline anxiety levels. While moving slowly through each part of the body, paying close attention to the feeling of the muscles relaxing and any sensation of warmth or heaviness. There is evidence for this technique being effective in alleviating feelings of both acute anxiety and chronic anxiety when performed regularly. This is secondary to the muscle relaxation after it, stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, release of endorphins, reduction in cortisol levels, as well as the mental clarity achieved in focusing on the present moment sensations which go largely unnoticed during most of our day whilst being on autopilot. The next technique I want to address is biofeedback. So biofeedback is not an intervention in itself, but a diagnostic tool which may further aid in applying interventions that are targeted and specific to the individual. Biofeedback is a technique that uses electronic monitoring devices to measure and provide information to the patients about their physiological activities. The concept is based on the fact that this observable measurement enhances awareness the individual has on how their thoughts, emotions, breathing patterns, and other behaviors directly affect their unique physiological responses and aid in learning how to control these processes consciously. Common types of biofeedback include heart rate variability. This measures the time variation between heartbeats. Electromyography, otherwise known as EMG biofeedback. This measures muscle tension. Thermal biofeedback, which measures skin temperature. Electrodermal activity biofeedback, which measures sweat gland activity. And there are others which measure other physiological parameters. So the method includes patients being connected to sensors that provide real-time feedback about their biological processes through a display on a monitor. This data allows them to make conscious adjustments to their thoughts, emotions, or behavior, which can influence their physiological state. Techniques such as controlled breathing or mental exercises are used to alter the readings. So say for stress and anxiety reduction, by observing physiological responses during stress, such as heart rate variability, elevated heart rate, respiratory rate, sweat production, blood pressure, the sensation of dizziness, tension headaches, or increased muscle tension, individuals can learn techniques to control these responses and thereby reducing anxiety. There is ample evidence supporting biofeedback in numerous contexts, including those of anxiety and stress. Now, obviously, a large part of the symptom reduction will be a direct result of the techniques used during these sessions. The biofeedback aspect, i.e. the direct measurement of physiological responses, purely serves to further aid in the targeting of effective techniques on an individual basis through a more clear observation of the mind-body connection, which often goes neglected. Next, mindfulness, exercise, and yoga, more in relation to chronic anxiety or stress. The timeless practice of mindfulness meditation, including yoga and regular exercise, are also backed by a wealth of research. And not only that, they transcend the realms of scientific measurement in their subjective effects. I've spoken on these various other segments, and so will not expand on these now, only to say that these two, of course, all play a significant role. Next, beta blockers. So commonly prescribed for its role specifically in performance anxiety are beta blockers. These work by blocking the effects of adrenaline, which is present at states of physiological arousal. These are usually used on as a required basis to combat the physical symptoms associated with anxiety, which may include palpitations, sweating, tremor, and so on. They're particularly useful for those with performance anxiety as they can be taken in advance of a situation whereby an individual may be significantly impeded by this response. Take the example of a singer with a quivering voice or a surgeon with hand tremors. So moving on to the other associated hormones, I've obviously touched on the main hormonal responses that relate to stress and anxiety, being that of the HPA axis and subsequent cortisol production. Now, there are obviously others that are key to consider. Thyroid levels, if abnormal, may certainly, amongst other symptoms, give rise to the state of anxiety, and therefore checking and rectifying these if abnormal is obviously paramount to good health. Other hormones that play a key role in differing ways are estrogen and progesterone for females and testosterone for men. So for females, estrogen influences brain functions through several mechanisms. It enhances the effects of serotonin and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters that play crucial roles in the regulation of mood and anxiety. Estrogen can increase the number of serotonin receptors in the brain, enhance serotonin synthesis, and alter its reuptake. This hormone also affects the production and release of endorphins, which are, as previously discussed, natural mood stabilizers. Progesterone, on the other hand, has a calming effect, primarily through its effect on GABAergic activity. Progesterone also tempers the effects of estrogen, providing a balance that is crucial for emotional regulation. Moving from theoretical understanding to observable effects, it's most obvious to look at menstrual cycle-related fluctuations in mood. It's no secret that fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle affect mood and anxiety levels. For instance, during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, which is typically days 14 to 28 of a typical menstrual cycle, when progesterone peaks, studies demonstrate increase in women reporting marked increase in symptoms of anxiety and irritability. Conversely, the drop in estrogen just before the menstruation phase may also lead to mood dips and heightened anxiety. As it relates to research involving hormonal contraceptive use, which stabilizes estrogen and progesterone levels, this has shown mixed results on mood. Some studies suggest they lower anxiety, while others indicate they may contribute to mood instability in a subset of women. Simply put, the picture is murky when looking at the psychological effects of these hormones when they are within healthy levels. When symptoms in relation to these levels during the cycle are disruptive enough, these are issues that would be helpful to address in their own right. At this point, this significant disruption goes by the name of either premenstrual syndrome and the more severe premenstrual dysphoric disorder, each of which I can go into further in future episodes. Moving on to males, we certainly have an easier time of it as it relates to the sex hormones, but there are definitely some things to consider as it relates to testosterone. Testosterone is generally considered to have anxiolytic effects, i.e., anxiety-reducing properties. Lower testosterone levels in men are correlated with high rates of anxiety and depression. This is in part due to interactions with various transmitters including serotonin and dopamine. Due to the systemic effects this hormone has, when levels are optimal, it's also associated with an increase in confidence and reduced aversion to fear. And to stress, this is when levels are optimal. When levels are above this, alongside the wealth of medical consequences, psychologically you see an increase in reported aggression, irritability, stress, depression, and occasionally hypomania. This topic, I believe, is worth more consideration than is currently given. When I speak of optimal levels, well, I'm referring to the range that is clinically referred to. Well, it's my view and the view of others who have looked into this topic that this cutoff is beset with problems. The idea that the cutoff is the same for a 50-year-old as for a 25-year-old is ludicrous, and therefore it would be fair to say, as others have, that the cutoff point when considering levels of younger males is largely an inappropriate means to establishing at which point replacement may be beneficial, which, as we have stated, have significant effects on quality of life. This, again, is a larger topic which I'll reserve for another day. Moving on to the next hormone, oxytocin. This is often referred to as the love hormone because of its roles in social bonding, childbirth, and maternal behaviors. But it also has significant effects on anxiety, stress, and mood. Oxytocin naturally modulates stress responses primarily by promoting social bonding and enhancing feelings of trust and empathy. It's linked to decreased anxiety levels and increased social behaviors, which can provide psychological stability and stress resilience. Alongside its direct effects which promote these states, its indirect effects on dampening the stress response and decreasing cortisol levels also contributes to this. When speaking of hormones in this context, we're speaking of their effects on the body when produced endogenously, i.e. our body producing it naturally. Oxytocin, when produced naturally, is well known to produce these positive effects listed. Now, extrapolating this understanding, it's no surprise that research into the exogenous administration of this hormone is subject to research as potential treatment for both anxiety and stress. Currently, the administration via nasal sprays or injections are available. These increase oxytocin levels in the bloodstream and possibly in the brain. The studies done have mixed results in that some studies demonstrate efficacy and others don't. Now, the mixed results from these studies of exogenous oxytocin versus the more consistent findings regarding the anxiolytic effects of endogenous oxytocin may stem from several factors. These may be delivery and dosage, so nasal sprays might not consistently replicate the effects of naturally occurring oxytocin release within the brain. The psychological and social context being that the individual's psychological state, social environment, and interpersonal relationships can influence how oxytocin affects them. Another factor to take into account is the neurological impact. So endogenous oxytocin is part of a well-regulated physiological pathway, while exogenous oxytocin might bypass some of these regulatory mechanisms, leading to less predictable effects. The take-home lessons here that we can conclude from this is that at this point, exposing ourselves to experiences which increase naturally produced endogenous oxytocin is the most effective way of promoting states of trust, pro-social emotions, and reducing baseline levels of anxiety and stress. Now, potent ways in which this can be done include physical touch, especially skin-to-skin contact, social bonding, especially with loved ones. Massages can help, both giving and receiving, induces a rise in oxytocin. Exercise, particularly with others, for example team sports, yoga, and laughter is also a potent way of increasing natural levels of oxytocin. These all have acute effects, but incorporating just some of these as regular experiences go a long way in promoting states of well-being and our sense of belonging in the world. Well, that sums up this episode on the relevant hormonal and nervous system responses that underpin the state of both acute and chronic anxiety, as well as the most effective techniques known to counteract their effects. And be sure to check out the next and final episode, which will be a brief detailing of the critical supplements in this space. Anyway, thank you for listening.